Let's begin the second session. Second session deals with trade, investment, and other issues. In the first session, I think the discussion largely focused on the Trump administration's foreign policy. I think Ambassador Robinson nicely put it. What matters is not about U.S. engagement, but the roles and characteristics of the engagement. And three speakers, had a very enlightening discussion. And because time is limited, three presenters didn't really talk much about trilateral cooperation, but that is our theme. So the second session, let me do it this way. We will have maybe three rounds of discussion. The first round is kind of building up for the cooperation. What the Trump's economic policy means to your individual countries' economies. Obviously, there's a huge challenge to Australia, Japan, and Korea and their economies. Particularly, three countries support rules-based liberal international order, multilateralism, economic interdependence, globalization. But the level of challenge obviously differs according to where you stand, according to the allies. So what's your country's utmost concern with regard to Trump policy? And what are the responses so far to how your government or policy circles think of responding to imminent Trump threat in terms of tariffs and others. So that's our first round. And second round, with that, how three countries can cooperate, and what are the areas we can cooperate, and what are the areas that are not really feasible because of the differences of the three countries. And the third round, I will I'll try hard to make time for your questions to the panelists. The first round, roughly 8 minutes for the framing, remarks on the questions that I just raised to you. So, Melissa, you want to go first?
Well, thank you, and thank you for that very clear idea of thinking first, what are the challenges, and then what are the opportunities? What can we do? Now, I know the challenges are going to be great, and I think that's because we've had a Trump administration already. We do know what a second Trump administration is going to mean. And if you're thinking about the impact on trade and technology, then I think you're looking at things like, yes, there are going to be higher tariffs, lower tax, changes on migration, and sustained challenges to what we might think of as a rules-based trade order. What that means for Australia is actually mostly indirect. So if you think about directly, the US, despite being, I think, our fifth largest trading partner, is only 5% of our exports. So if large tariffs are put on Australia, that's not going to be a massive problem. It would be very unfortunate because that 5% is some of the best of the sort of advanced manufacturing that we have, and we would very much like to keep that, but there it is, we can cope. I'm not an economist myself, but there was a survey recently of 39 of Australia's leading economists, and when they were asked what will the impact of another Trump administration be on Australia's economy, they said, firstly, it'll be the a decreased pace in trying to lower global emissions around climate change. Secondly, it'll be higher US inflation. And thirdly, it'll be weaker Chinese growth. So if you see it in those terms, they're all indirect in that sense for us. Now,
sorry, what was the third one?
Weaker Chinese growth. So I'll talk a bit about each of them. So in terms of the climate side, obviously that's going to affect everybody. We know what the science tells us. We know that there's an imperative for a transition to a green economy, and the US second Trump administration is going to, basically, I would see it as count itself out of a lot of the discussions and efforts that are taking place. But I think we can overstate that in the sense that so much of the impetus for green energy transition is now not so much in government, it's everywhere else. It's in provincial level governments, in cities, in business. The economic imperatives are so strong now that I think even a Trump administration is actually not going to be able to slow it as much as it might want to. On the second point, on the US inflation, I'm just assuming that's a given, that if you go into the election with policies on limiting migration and reducing taxes, you are going to have inflation in the US. And that's then going to affect everyone else. It's going to affect interest rates globally, and that really will affect Australia and Australia's politics. It's going to affect, for example, our ability to borrow and the rates that we're able to borrow at. I think the biggest one in many ways for me is what it means for Chinese growth. So Australia's economy, we have, more than 30% of our exports go to China. So from that perspective, anything that happens in the Chinese economy affects the Australian economy, and that's just the way it is. If we're imagining 60% tariffs on the Chinese economy, then you have to say, well, what will that do to a slowdown? What will that do to Chinese demand for Australian products? So that's the sort of biggest unknown for us. We did say in this that we'll talk a bit about technology, and I see that also as an area that is going to affect everybody, including Australia. I see this sort of techno-nationalism taking off, this idea that technology is, a realm of security and national resilience. If we see something as big as the sort of ever-threatened great tech decoupling, then that's a problem. It's not necessarily so much a direct problem for us because we fit very well with US technology systems. It's more that if you have a bifurcated world, how do you deal with countries in the Pacific, in Southeast Asia? How do we manage if that technology has turned into a complete barrier rather than something that engages between countries? Overall, I think the biggest effect are those global order effects. So if you're thinking about what does, US tariffs turn into tit-for-tat tariffs everywhere. What does that mean economically? One that I was interested to read about is global shipping costs. Australia cares about that because so much of everything we produce, it goes out in shipping. Apparently, during the first Trump administration, container shipping costs spiked by 70%. So, those sort of systemic effects of what's happening in the US, I think will affect us all. Obviously, what the US does with World Trade Organization, we have found many workarounds for the fact that the US is no longer really supporting that trading order, but we're going to have to find more, basically. And that sense that, for a country like Australia, we're an open trading nation. That's who we've always been. Anything that restricts global trade is bad for us. I think I would also say maybe my final one is just unpredictability in itself is bad for trade. It's bad for trade, it's bad for investment, it's bad for planning. And a country like Australia does not want to have the level of unpredictability in the system that we are undoubtedly going to have with a Trump administration. So I think they're the key challenges. Now, On the good side, I always try to find the positive. Some of those have opportunities in them. So any disruption does offer opportunities. And we may see Australian trade moving in to take the place of US products if there are tit for tat tariffs. We could benefit slightly from that. I think the bigger hope, and this really is me trying to find some optimism in a not particularly fantastic situation, is that this may change Australia's mindset. It's a mindset that we've been changing over many decades, but something that will happen under the Trump administration is we just can't rely on the US in all sorts of ways, in all sorts of places. That makes us a bit more self-reliant, which is good. But it also means that we could choose to focus less on the US and more on other partners, like Japan, our second largest trading partner, and Korea, our third largest export destination. And there's a real potential in that. And maybe the sheer chaos and unpredictability of the Trump administration will help us do better on that, which we should have been doing anyway.
Yes. How about Japan? Maybe more than largely indirect.
Yeah, thank you. I see it's a great honor for me to be a part of this important meeting. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm an economist, so I don't know anything about the complicated world politics, actually. But watching for what happened after the first Trump administration, what would happen economically, things. Two major policy tools over there. One is tariffs or tariff war. And the other is high-tech export control. I think those two are very sort of major policies that the U.S. and partially sort of Chinese side also implemented. So I talked about that very briefly for those two policies. And then the third point is how far the Chinese economy can be decoupled. I think many people in Japan and maybe in Korea too claim that we really have to reduce the dependency on the Chinese economy. But maybe the private sector is not really following that kind of instruction. So I like to talk about that at the last point. For tariffs, tariffs are very powerful tool for restricting trade, of course. That's very powerful. But at the same time, among various kinds of trade restrictive policies, the most transparent and predictable. So once tariffs are imposed, what would happen is a pretty clear cut as far as tariffs are used as a usual way, particularly in terms of rules of origin. So in case of Japan, maybe US would impose 10% or 20% tariffs on Japanese exports. So of course that would generate negative effects. But 10%, 20% is actually smaller than exchange rate fluctuation. So we will not die. We will not die because of that. So that, certainly negative effects are coming, but we don't die. And also, in case of Japanese companies, operations in China, they are not exporting to US. That portion is very few now, very, very few. So even if China was imposed a very high tariff, 60% to 100%, that portion doesn't really affect. Big effects are not coming. And also, on the US side, in order to sell to the US market, many are produced in Japanese affiliates in the United States already too. So I think Japan did that kind of preparation for a long time. So certainly tariffs would affect negatively, but the effects are sort of limited in a sense. The China and the US bilateral tariffs would be very high from now on. But the US side, certainly, trade reduced, obviously. That's very trade will be reduced as pretty large extent. But the U.S. We had an empirical study on so-called tariff pass-through. Tariff pass-through is that if tariffs are, say, for example, China's exports to the U.S. and the U.S. side imposes 25% tariffs, then how far that imported goods prices in the United States will raise. Also 25%, and we say tariff pass-through 100%. And then we have a bunch of empirical studies saying that the U.S. tariff pass-through is almost 100%. So that means that the U.S. consumers should feel the price rise over there, but partially cancelled out by third countries' exports to the U.S. And also, the U.S. economy, domestic economy is huge, fortunately or unfortunately. So there's a simulation study saying that if the U.S. stops all international trade, zero trade, then how far U.S. GDP would be reduced? That's only 4 to 6%. So of course, not really taking care of very precious rare metal or something, but that's the idea. So very unfortunately, U.S. consumers do not feel much. So now there's a big campaign of economists in the U.S. saying that the tariffs are so bad because of the raised inflation, but it may not work, unfortunately. So this is another problem of a big country. So the China side, of course, that should be very painful. But now they are really investing in strategic autonomy very strongly. So a lot of investment is going on. And also the trade and foreign direct investment with the third countries, those are increasing too. So I think they are not dead because of the high tariffs anyway. So and then the effects on the third countries like ASEAN member states, the tariff differential is there. So I mean that U.S. China has a very high tariff, and then others are the existing tariffs, or maybe 10%. So as far as the differential is big, then they may have larger positive trade diversion effects. So Vietnam, Malaysia, and others maybe pick up more investment, not only from China, but also from other countries to export to the U.S. So I think that would happen if tariffs are normal, of course. But if tariff may not be normal from now on, for example, usually we have rules of origin. Then so if products are exported from Malaysia to the U.S., then goods have an origin in Malaysia, then the same tariff rate must apply. But they may use a sort of different system, for example, in terms of farm nationality basis, or maybe input intermediate goods basis. For example, such and such semiconductors produced in China should not be used, for example. Then things are much more complicated. Actually, compliance cost is much higher than usual tariffs. So the things may be much more complicated. So that's the tariffs. So I think that the tariffs are terrible, and we will have overall negative effects, but we can survive. For the second, the high-tech export control, that's much more complicated. So one thing is that policy implementation is not really watched by outsiders at all. So how they can set a sort of line of restricted portion and unrestricted portion, those are not quite clear, particularly from the viewpoint of the third countries like Korea and Japan. And also, so I made a bunch of empirical studies on the trade effects of export control. Trade is not really restricted really directly. Actually, the restricted portion is very narrow in terms of the scope of commodities. So that is narrower than the most detailed classification of trade statistics. So So actually, the trade volume is big, but that is within a really detailed commodity classification. So if we do the empirical studies, and then that detailed items exports to the U.S. may increase or may decrease, actually. So it's not really a sort of a strong effects, at least for the direct effects on international trade. But we see a sort of a slowdown of foreign direct investment coming into China. So it's certainly one reason is a slowing down of the Chinese economy. So we cannot really separate out the effects, but some sort of uncertainty or a fear of chilling effect is really coming to the private sector outside of China, coming into China. So I think that effects would be very large. Then the effects of export control on, for example, ASEAN member states, those are sometimes positive. Now actually, it's in Vietnam, Malaysia, and also partially Thailand. A lot of foreign direct investment is coming in, particularly in semiconductors, and also data centers in Singapore, Malaysia, and other places. Those are accelerated. So again, the third countries may pick up some sort of positive effects over there. So I think that's a reality in the economy. So not for all bad for all people in the world, actually. So some are really picking up some positive effects, and also so that is good for the world, I think, because that cancels out partially for the negative effects of distorted, stupid policies. So that's the first and second point. Third point, China decoupling. So I understand that China would use a sort of economic tools for as a sort of economic coercion, economic statecraft. So that's a very strong argument, and that has a reason for worrying about that, of course. And then in Japan, and also maybe in Korea, we really have to reduce imports from China, and we have to scale down the economic activities inside China. Then private sector does not follow much. So because they have economic incentive for doing that, so in case of Japanese companies, so at least the China-only strategy would survive if they produce in China and sell to the Chinese market. So they may have some problem in the future, but now they are raising profit, and then they just think at the cost and the benefit, and okay, we have to stay and do a little more. So I think that would happen. And think of other countries, companies for EU and others, they set a different line of a dangerous portion and others too. So I think the connection between China and other countries, even in Western countries, so that will not be zero anyway. And also the Chinese economies are now strengthening the connection to the third world. So actually, it's not really containment or decoupling. The Chinese economy will survive anyway. But of course, in the short run, they are having maybe a lot of negative effects because of that. So, but they would survive anyway. So at the end, they will be there. So we have to think how to live with them. So that would be one thing that we have to think of in addition to how to respond right now in the short run. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Very, very interesting. Now turn to Korea.
Okay. First of all,
Dr. Lee.
I'd like to thank the East Asia Institute and the President Sonia for graciously inviting me to this relevant and timely event. At the request of President Sonia, my discussion will focus on the potential impacts of Trump's tariff policy on Korean economy, alongside the broader economic consequences arising from the ongoing decoupling between the United States and China. With respect to impact of Trump's tariff policies on Korea, I think we need to actually pay attention in the two channels. First one is trade channel, and the other one is actually macroeconomic channel, which means that broader, macroeconomic repercussion. So these tariff policy would not only undermine actually the Korea's export performance, but could also reinforce actually inflationary pressure that actually Professor Kimura mentioned into the United States, which could keep the U.S. interest high and dollar strong, in turn impact the Korea's monetary policy, especially regarding interest rate and exchange rate. So again, regarding trade effects, our institute, Korea Institute for International Economic Policy, KIAP, has developed a total of 18 possible scenarios based on various potential, policy permutations. So these scenarios were analyzed using general and the partial equilibrium economic models to assess actually the economic implications. So each scenario here was actually constructed around the four critical consideration. So first one is enforcement mechanism of tariffs. So everything is still uncertain, whether the US government will impose additional universal tariff of 10% or 20%, or instead they actually adopt the reciprocal tariff. So there is already three different scenarios. And the second one is, in case of Korea, what if Korea as a FTA signatory is exempt from the universal tariff imposition? What could be the impact? And third one is naturally tariffs rate applied to China is also different. So additional 25% tariffs under the section 301 of the Trade Act, or just the escalation to the 60%. And finally, we also consider the situation where the other countries also impose this retaliatory tariff by the equivalent level. So because of that, you can make more than actually 18 scenarios or something like that. And so our result actually indicate that the most favorable scenario for Korea involves either exemption from the universal tariff as a FTA signatory, or adoption of reciprocal tariffs by the United States instead of universal tariffs. Under these conditions, Korea's real GDP could even increase by approximately 0.1 or 0.2%, primarily because of a trade diversion impact. So China actually have a quite high, the tariff, and the other countries, non-FTA, the signatories have a high level of tariff, which means that we can have some trade diversion in favor of Korea. So in that case, that might actually increase GDP and the trade. Conversely, the most detrimental scenario for Korea would be entail the 20% universal tariff imposed by the United States. At the same time, these other countries also impose tariff. In such a case, Korea's export could contract by as much as 6%. And its real GDP potentially would decline by 0.3% or 0.6%, depending on whether Korea succeeded in the effective trade diversification or not. So that really depends on how this tariff policy actually imposed by the United States. And another one is quite the interesting thing is our estimation also indicate that the magnitude of Korea's export reduction under these universal tariffs could be relatively smaller than other major trading partners, countries such as China, Canada, Mexico, EU, and Japan. Well, as actually Melissa mentioned, the export share destined to United States of Australia is only 4.2% or 5%. So impact is relatively small. But even though Korea's the export reduction is smaller in magnitude, but it does not mean that it is not a problem. It posed significant challenges to Korea. because Korea is a trade-dependent country. So if we compare these three countries, Korea's trade to GDP ratio stands at around 74%, while Japan case is 35% and Australia case is 38%. So that means that South Korea's heightened vulnerability to these external economic shifts. And another potential concern that actually Japan already experienced is that if United States trade deficit problem is not resolved despite Trump's tariff policies, which is most likely, that it may lead to exchange rate appreciation pressure similar to the Plaza Accord in the mid-1980s. So recently I visited, the San Francisco, participated in this, big, conference organized by, American Economic Association, and Professor Maurice Ospelt of UC Berkeley actually claimed that Trump's policy team is already serious considering it, and maybe in the early next year, Trump could invite the financial ministers of major countries to Mar-a-Lago, okay, the resort owned by President-elect Trump in Palm Beach, and unilaterally negotiate a Mar-a-Lago Accord, similar to the Plaza Accord. So that's also possibility. So this suggests that anytime U.S. this policy could shift from the tariff to exchange rate pressure, or U.S. government can use the combination of these two. So we usually focus on only this tariff policy, but three countries also somehow prepare for the this shift of this policy. And now turning to the issue of U.S. China decoupling, I would like to highlight two interesting observations regarding recent development before delving into this implication for Korea and maybe China. So first observation is that the decoupling process between two countries is unfolding asymmetrically. So since the escalation of this U.S.-China tensions in 2017, the United States has reduced its reliance on the import from China. But if you look at the other side, the share of U.S. export to China in U.S. total export has remained relatively stable. So this is quite asymmetric. If we move to this financial sector, again, decoupling appears more pronounced on this China side, as evidenced by the decline in China's share of U.S. equity and bond investment. In contrast, the U.S. share of equity and bond investment in China has still continued to grow. And second observation that I'd like to highlight is China has been mitigating this impact of U.S. export and the financial sanctions by leveraging indirect channels to access the American market. So for example, China actually make up more foreign direct investment in Vietnam, Taiwan, and Mexico, and they actually put this patent component and export to. So now, United States government is pretty much actually focusing on these issues on Mexico, but at any time, it could be actually extended to other countries, including the Vietnam and Taiwan. Again, financial sector, China is mitigating this effect of decouplings by shifting this investment to Hong Kong, or actually China investing in the United States through Hong Kong. So that means still we are pretty much talk of the decoupling, but there is some other way actually bypass those kind of decoupling issues. If I just give us some empirical result, is that the relative contribution of this indirect export to China's total value-added general value export to United States has risen. In 2016, that was around 17%, but 2020 it actually increased up to 22%. So you will see that as United States pushed more and more, sanctions against, tariff policies, then you can see that there is a lot of, indirect, export. And as of 2022, primary conduct for this Chinese indirect export to United States, Mexico first, and Vietnam, Canada, Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan in that order. And accounting for almost 70% is actually passed through these countries. And recently, the share of Vietnam and Taiwan has risen significantly. So again, that means that there will be not only pressure on Mexico, but pressure on those countries, like Vietnam and Taiwan, and maybe Korea and Japan could be also the target for this indirect. And then now let's move to the impact on Chinese economy by this decoupling. I believe that Trump's decoupling policy is likely to pose significant obstacle to Chinese economic and technology ascent, at least in the short run and the long run, midterm. However, you always remember that also acts as a powerful catalyst for China to accelerating the development of this self-reliant technology, which already somehow successful. So that actually leaving that what could be the long-term impact is still uncertain, whether that is actually reduce Chinese, power or increase Chinese power. And as far as concerned, because nowadays many people talk about these peak China issues, but if you look at the Chinese economic success, it's not that much depending upon this external factor. Key factor is actually the internal domestic issues that include because Chinese economy is over-reliant on the investment and this local government debt and also sluggish, real estate sector, stagnant productivity, and naturally aging populations. So these structural issues will significantly influence whether China can sustain its competition with the United States for global hegemony. So I do some math, simple math, that as of 2022, the size of Chinese GDP is around 78% of US. And now let's assume that the United States actually grow at 2%. Then if China actually grow at 5%, then maybe year 2031, the size will be same. And the year by 2050, then Chinese actually GDP size is almost 1.8 times bigger than United States. But growing 5% seems not feasible for now. So I actually do some other math that what if China actually grow by only 3%? In that case, China can actually catch up the United States by 2050. And the size will be pretty much the same, but not like 1.5 times bigger or something like that. So we have to look at this Chinese economic growth rate that whether future will be really depend on. But still, Chinese growth rate slowdown does not mean that China does not actually develop technologically. Korea growth rate is low, but compared to the 10 or 20 years ago, technology is much higher. So we will see a lot of surprise in technology, but overall, this economic prospect is a little bit gloomy for China. Finally, maybe Korea. The ongoing decoupling present both significant challenges as well as the potential opportunities. So in recent year, Chinese rapid technological advance has intensified the competitive pressure on South Korea, particularly in the high-tech industries. So if you look at this trade balance between Korea and China, if you just get rid of this semiconductor sector, which is the biggest one, and then Korea already turned to the trade deficit situation in the 2021, and this is ever growing. So I think in that context, this U.S. China decoupling may offer Korea as a short-term relief by slowing this China's technology catching up. However, finally, the decoupling also poses a significant risk because China is the largest destination for Korean export, and so any disruption in trade relations will severe, economic hardship for Korea. So this is both opportunity and the challenges, and we will see what's going to happen.
Thank you very much for those three remarks, which are really enlightening. Seems to me that two or three impressions. One, maybe that impact, let me say, propensity of Trump tariffs and export controls or decoupling pressures really varies across three countries. It seems like much lesser to Australia, lesser to Japan, and heavier to South Korea. So there are variations, and that may be a source of cooperation and also maybe a bit of barriers, obstacles. So we will discuss that. And two is that also the view of China's economic future. Obviously, economists are less pessimistic than IR persons. So who's right, we will discuss. And three, I think it is really important that there are clearly beneficiaries out of this, tariff wars and export controls. And those are the areas that we, three countries, may collaborate to, work and engage with. So with that, why don't we just spend, each of you spend 3 minutes maybe to, give us what are the items that we will need to cooperate, and what are the most promising areas we cooperate.
Absolutely.
Melissa.
So thinking about, what sort of strategies can we develop in this environment that I think we're all seeing? I'd say to start with that Australia is adapting, and you can see us adapting in front of your eyes. So we are traditionally very much a free trading nation. We care about our rules-based international order. But we recognise that rules are changing. So our Treasurer, for example, said it would be tremendously self-defeating if we didn't adapt given the global churn of the economy. So you see things like we now have a Future Made in Australia Act, which has a lot more government intervention in markets than we would usually have considered reasonable. So that's 22 billion into clean energy, strategic industries around national security and economic resilience, and that's a big change for us. Now, I know that's not as much of a change for some other countries, but for us that is. So I suppose when we're thinking of strategies, diversification is clearly one of them. And, both Korea and Japan as very large export partners are an important part of that. I'd put, though, that the green economy transition is actually something of an issue we have to manage. So Australia is under a lot of pressure to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, not least by our neighbours in the Pacific who see this as an existential threat. And Japanese and Korean desire for Australian resources is actually somewhat at odds with that transition. So thinking about how we can all be partners in the green energy transition within our countries and in the region more generally, I think is a very interesting area, and one that I'm not sure if Korea and Japan are thinking of Australia in that way, in a way that they could. In something like critical minerals, that's another thing that's often brought up as an area where there can be, more trilateral cooperation. I think that's an interesting example in that, again, it's quite complex for Australia. So, we're a wonderful critical minerals supplier. That's a vital thing for security and for the future. You'd think we'd do very well from, the US wanting to friendshore, to have all of the sort of, mineral security partnership and all the rest. But it's not so easy because we're heavily dependent upon China in terms of midstream processing and the manufacturing side. So I think there could be some real opportunities to work much more with Japan and South Korea on those areas, which we're not currently able to do ourselves. But I would say overall, I think the biggest thing is around global rules-based order, and thinking about what partnerships we can achieve because we have those shared goals, what partnerships can we work on? So I was very interested. I thought Special Representative Chung put it very well, talking about the importance of that solidarity among the like-minded. If we are countries that care about a global rule-based order, and I think we are, whether you call us middle powers or something else, we are countries that care about that because we don't like might, we like rules. Rules are good. What can we actually be doing? Because, and I think Ambassador Robinson, you put it very well, that, we have fundamentally aligned strategic interests. What can we do with that? I think the last point I'd make in terms of where we can work together might be in terms of other countries. So if we're talking about Southeast Asia and the Pacific, we are important countries in terms of their development assistance, in terms of investment, and the choices, giving them choices, the way Ambassador Robinson talked about it, in strategic equilibrium, making sure that the region isn't dominated by any one country, building their resilience to withstand economic coercion, making sure they have choices about their development futures. We all have a very important role in that. So maybe I'll conclude with a point that I thought Thomas raised really well, which is the sort of, are we trying to build an institution as such? Is that what we're after? Do we want a trilateral that has a great name and that has institutional architecture? Is that what we're after? Or is it something slightly different? And I want to go that direction. Potentially, I think it's not so much sort of what we do, but how we do it together, how we think about some of these issues as being shared issues. And I think Special Representative Chung put it well when she talked about viewing the region with a trilateral lens. Okay, so when I'm looking at a problem, whatever a problem it is in this region, that I take the trilateral lens rather than just my perspective. And in that sense, it's more a change of a way of thinking. It's a switch in your mind where you say, well, we have a problem, whatever it is. And I thought a great example we talked about was looking at maritime issues with the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific. And instead of just saying, well, that's an Australia issue and that's a Korea issue, well, let's actually do something together on it. So I found I was lucky enough to be involved in some of these Track 1.5 initiatives, which really got me thinking again. I hadn't had Korea very much in my consciousness for a few years because I'd been focusing on other issues. And it was just saying, oh yes, let's switch that on. Let's remind myself that these things can be done really well together. So I would be saying when Korea is working on increasing its engagement with South Pacific countries, which is happening at the moment, how much is Korea thinking about Australia and Japan and what we can do together? Or when Australia is thinking about its Southeast Asian investment and trade, which we are currently doing at the moment, how much are we talking to Japan and South Korea and working together in those areas? So from my perspective, I think there's no lack of opportunities to work together on common problems. It's that trick of thinking about how we see ourselves. And for Australia in particular, and I will finish up very quickly, I know. I was more even on my two answers. For Australia in particular, I think it's this balance between the way we see ourselves as an ally or as an active middle power. And sometimes we focus mostly on the ally bit. And this is a moment where we have to focus a lot more on being an active middle power. I think we can have a role. We can, with this lattice work, actually be doing a lot to create the region we want to live in. So I would, very much commend EAI on the initiative of helping us change our thinking about how we see each other and the way we can work together on common problems.
Great. Thank you very much. And next, the Fuku.
Yeah, thank you. So under a sort of really harsh geographical tension in the region, I think some part of the economy would be much more restricted in a sense. So, I think that portion are sort of inevitable, but the rest of the economy should keep vigorous somehow. So I think because the decoupling is partial anyway at the end, so we have to think of the rest of the economy very seriously too. So actually the restricted portion of the economy is much smaller than probably we're expecting. More than 90% of the world economy is still working actually. So from that viewpoint, I think the regional initiatives are extremely important because we have a very active area, so ASEAN and also Northeast Asia. So I think we have to reduce policy uncertainty as much as possible. It's very difficult, of course, and also retain the rule-based trading regime as widely as possible. And then we would expect that the U.S. engagement to this region may reduce from now on. So think of a sort of a good balance between East and West in this area. I think I'm worrying about that a lot. So economic diplomacy is a relatively relatively costless tool to think of that. So I think so together with ASEAN and other third countries, try to support WTO, talking about dispute settlement. Korea should come into MPIA. That kind of things should be discussed much more. And also a bunch of regional initiatives. RCEP, so of course, it's sort of limited that we can utilize that, but China is a member over there. So maybe we can utilize as a sort of reducing policy risks to some extent. IPEF may be dead, but the second pillar, supply chain agreement, may be utilized to reduce a sort of policy risks to some extent. And also Indonesia is now negotiating with OECD to come in, and also applied for CPTPP. Indonesia cannot be said a sort of a best student in WTO at all, actually. But they have a big government. Some part of government would like to have a very strong aspiration of becoming a respectable, developed country. I think we have to think much of that kind of ambition. That we really have to support that kind of movements. So I think together with Japan, Korea, and Australia, there are many things that we can do in the regional level, and in order to retain a sort of rule-based regime. So I think that's a very important thing among these our countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so I talked too much in the first round, so I will just save the time. And so what I'm thinking is, current global landscape with the escalating these geopolitical and the geoeconomic tensions. So we usually talk about the collaboration among the like-minded countries, but now as the international environment actually shift to emphasize national interest. So this is a shift from the values to interest. So we have to recognize that the cooperations among these like-minded countries should be complemented by like-positioned countries as well. Because, for example, Japan and Korea is facing this, tariff policy from United States. Actually, the trade share destined to the United States is pretty much the same for Japan and Korea, and both countries actually suffer from also this issue of a trade surplus vis-a-vis the United States, and so a lot of things is going on. So I think best candidate so far for these like-positioned countries cooperation for Korea could be Japan and Taiwan and maybe Germany. So those countries are pretty much focusing on the manufacturing export. But at the same time, these three countries is quite complementary in a lot of these production value chains. So Australia has been a really strong provider for Korea for these raw materials and the internet input as well as technology for a long time, since the economic take-off in the 1960s. So now maybe these three countries may play not only for the cooperation among these two countries, but also, as Chairman Ha mentioned, linchpin roles in the expanded trilateral cooperations within the region. So I think we have a lot of work to do.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, so the second round has been done, and yes, there are very important and interesting proposals. We have about 10 minutes. So any questions or comments from the floor?
네, 안녕하십니까. 저는 그 하나카드 계약지 FDS 부서에서 일하고 있는 이현우라고 합니다. 그 제가 궁금한 거를 챗 GPT한테 물어봤어요.
네?
챗 GPT한테 물어봤어요. 근데 일단은 미국이 환율, 그러니까 그 관세 정책이랑 플라자 합의를 한다라고 나와 있고, 두 번째로는 상개국의 협력 방안은 너무 좋은 것 같고, 부정적인 시나리오는 이게 협력이 실패할 경우에는 내부 갈등 해결 실패 시 협력 체계 악화, 중국과 미국 압박에 동시 대응 실패로 경제적 외교적 고립이 나와 있는데, 그럴 경우에는 어떻게 해결할 것이며, 마지막으로는 이거 좋은 방안인 것 같긴 한데 이게 잘 되려는지 모르겠습니다. 그 한일 호주가 같이 환율 방어 기금 설립을 해서 환율 방어하는 것도 어떤 방안인지 생각하시는지.
알겠어요. 예, 고맙습니다. Any yes.
Because I'm Korean, I cannot help asking to President Lee. But because President Trump has vowed he will discontinue the IRA, So Samsung and SK, they invested heavily, expecting the subsidies, right? And if that happens, what kind of their strategy, or can Korean government can negotiate for their investment, that kind of things?
So may I respond to
yes, please.
Yeah. So I think my personal take is it's really hard to abolish this IRA or Science Chips Act. because that actually required the approval by the Congress as well as House of Representatives, because this is law, act. So that means Trump has a lot of agendas. So I don't think that actually put that the central stage for this abolishment. But what the Trump can do is just make a higher requirement, more the difficult to provide the subsidies, or just you make some delay. So that's the maybe only possibilities, because most of investment related to the IRA and the Science Chips Act is the state that actually governed by Republicans. So Texas and Georgia and something like that. So that's really difficult. But still, we could actually cooperate with the local government, because that's the government really needed that investment. So even though federal government put that those kind of obstacles, but still we can actually cooperate with the local government. So that's the kind of alternative. And about the pleasure code, so as I mentioned, that actually some people actually talk about that. But issue is in 1980s, Japan and Germany, two biggest countries at the time, actually evaluate this impact, and these two countries think that instead of receiving this tariff or something like that, it is more better situation to accept this the exchange rate appreciation. But now China will never ever actually accept this the proposal. Not only economic terms, but also this is kind of a coercion by the United States' domestic policy. So I don't think that we can have really the Mar-a-Lago occurred. But what I like to emphasize is this pressure on the exchange operation will be actually somehow prolonged. So during the tenure of this second Trump administration.
Yes, no questions. So let me conclude. Not conclude the whole contents of today's discussion. Instead, I think that return of Trump presidency is received quite differently, not only among the three countries, but also the countries in ASEAN members and other part of the area. So seems like we need a more broader perspective to evaluate and respond to the Trump 2.0, and in that sense, three countries, Australia, Japan, and South Korea, will need to talk more and collaborate more, not only on the three-way cooperations for the benefits, but also for the regional stability and prosperity, and also the global order that you just mentioned. And I'm not sure we still coin middle powers that characterize three countries cooperation, but clearly we need like-minded countries to help shape the new international order, and in that sense, I think three countries are the critical partners for the United States, and hope to persuade United States not to go far, and hopefully get back to the track that United States actually has established and the three countries benefited from. And So next 4 years, under Trump 2.0, Australia, Japan, and South Korea, government level and also intellectual level, we need to collaborate more. And in that sense, today's session is I think it's just the beginning of our, 3-country collaboration, and we hope to continue. So with that, let me finish, and thank you very much for coming to the conference in early Saturday morning, and now it's already lunchtime. So thank you very much for coming to EAI once again, and to the panelists as well.